the Emperor of mankind, the Conqueror of the Galaxy, Father of Demigods. All great titles, but stop and think for a moment just what they mean. To conquer a galaxy, to reclaim humanity's empire across billions of worlds. Just what kind of war would that be? How bloody would it be? How many human lives would have to be lost? It would be more lives than any other war in the history of mankind, at least by man's own hands. And the Emperor, by way of reuniting Terra and branching out into the infinite cosmos on his great crusade, was responsible for it all. By result, the Emperor is likely one of the single largest human mass murderers to ever exist. He's also been accused of using his Primarks, beings who saw him as their father, as disposable tools. But just who was the Emperor before his fall onto the Golden Throne? At his core, the Emperor is a variant of human known as a Perpetual, a being that can't die by normal means, which makes him incredibly rare among humans, but not altogether unique. Many of the other greatest wars in mankind's history were disguised bids for power made by immortal humans just as long-lived as the Emperor. However, despite not being unique in that he could not die by normal means, the Emperor was special in that all of the other Perpetuals recognized him as the strongest among them. I'll bet many argued on whether he was the greatest. Even still, one by one, all of the other Perpetuals abandoned the Emperor and his plans in the end. Though the Emperor's exact age is unconfirmed, he is undoubtedly ancient. He's lived since men first conceptualized civilization. He watched as mankind created flight, then rocket technology, and finally the ability to colonize other worlds and then star systems. All the while, he sought to better mankind from the shadows. He observed us and lived among us, gently nudging things to try and make things turn out better by way of his limited, but still powerful foresight. The Emperor himself described his ability to predict the future as somewhat imperfect. He can see endpoints, certain best and worst possibilities, but the ways to get to any one outcome are blurry and largely up to his interpretation. In his own somewhat sarcastic words, the funny thing about being both all-knowing and all-powerful is that you can't be both at the same time. The Emperor made this somewhat sly statement while he mused on the nature of war. He also essentially stated, in the same conversation, that he is at times forced to sacrifice his followers. He knows that he's using people as tools, but says that this sort of aggressive strategy is sometimes the only way to prevent an enemy from winning, by way of surprising them with his brashness. When challenged and asked what happens when an enemy is just as clever as he is, and can't be surprised, he stated that if he allows that to make him play timidly, then his own fear could cause him to lose preemptively. When the Primark Guilliman reflects on whether his father actually loves every man, or just the idea of aiding mankind overall, the Emperor's son draws a parallel between himself and the master of mankind. Guilliman admits that, just as the Primarchs and humanity as a whole claim some sort of kinship to the Emperor, so too do many of Rebute's own Space Marines claim to be his son. Despite this, Guilliman admits that, while he cares for the Space Marines on the whole, he doesn't know the majority of their names. He doesn't know their thoughts, or the thoughts of the many non-altered Imperial Guardsmen he also often orders into death. He ultimately states that he never wanted to be a tyrant, or a man who decides when the lives of others end, but yet he too still finds himself in a position to spend human lives with every decision he makes. In the end, Guilliman admits that while he is as incapable of understanding his father as any human is incapable of understanding Rebute himself, that perhaps the Emperor never wanted to take on the mantle that he wore either. In the novel, Master of Mankind, Malcador the Sigillite asks the titular Emperor of the Imperium just why he lets the Primarchs call him father. Malcador seemed to see this as too sentimental for reasons he did not go on to elaborate about. The Emperor's response is somewhat dark-seeming upon first glance. He goes on to remark that there was once a story of a toy maker who created a toy that sought to become a real child. He elaborates that the toy could call the toy maker nothing else but father. Here it almost seems as if the Emperor is referring to the Primarchs as mere things playing at being human. However, what needs to be remembered is that, while Pinocchio, who the Emperor is referring to, did call Geppetto, his creator, father, Geppetto also called him son and treated him with as much affection as any real child. Still, some have argued that the Emperor planned to destroy his sons and their Space Marine legions after they were no longer needed, in order to allow the majority of humanity to take over their own rulership. This stance is largely supported in these arguments by the fact that he had dabbled with creating genetically modified shock troops before the creation of the Space Marines and their gene sires. When the Emperor first came to power on Terra, he did so through the creation of the Thunder Warriors. These proto-Space Marines were essentially berserker predecessors of the Adeptus Astartes. However, they were cobbled together with whatever technology the Emperor could scrounge together on a divided Earth. As an effect of this, they were unstable and prone to insanity and physical degradation. Though the Thunder Warriors were the superiors to the Space Marines in every conceivable physical regard, The trade-off for this was that their lifespans were incredibly short. They were simply not designed to live past the point of the unification of Terra. Some point to this and say that the Emperor showed that he indeed only views his creations as a means to an end by not designing the Thunder Warriors in a way where they wouldn't essentially self-destruct over time. Another point that is often brought up is how differently he treated a number of his Primarchs, almost seeming to pit them against each other and making them rival among one another for his love. For example, the Emperor was especially detached from his son Angron. Angron had been stranded on the planet of Nucaria as a child. He was quickly discovered by slavers and sold into gladiatorial combat. Nucaria was a highly advanced world, possessing technology that still persisted from the dark ages of man. One such piece of archaeo technology, the cruciamen, otherwise known as the butcher's nails, were a type of cortical implant that greatly enhanced the ferocity and strength of a warrior. These highly advanced pieces of technology took away every pleasure from a victim. They made breathing, thinking, eating, and even simply existing into an agonizing experience. The only way one could experience relief, and thus whatever happiness could be left to them, was through acts of violence in battle. Angron, having been sold into gladiatorial combat, was implanted with these cruel nails. He became a ruthless killer, the likes of which the planet of Nucaria had never known, and eventually led a gladiatorial rebellion against his masters. The rebellion, however, would go on to fail, as the Emperor of Mankind would teleport Angron away on the eve of its greatest battle. All of Angron's warriors were slain to the last man, making him one of the few Primarchs who was not allowed to integrate his followers into his own Space Marine Legion. For this reason, Angron long held a grudge against the Emperor of Mankind, and the Emperor likewise treated Angron with a special kind of aloofness, even unique among the almost cold distance that he kept, at times, with all of the Primarchs. Many used the Emperor's seeming detachment from his sons as yet another reason to say that he really didn't care for them at all, merely seeing them and their warriors as another means to an end. There's also the fact that some claimed the Emperor to be a hypocrite, for although he outlawed religion and espoused the atheistic imperial truth, he allowed the Adeptus Mechanicus of Mars to essentially worship him as their fabled Omnissiah merely because he needed their technology. All of these pieces of evidence combined can begin to add up to appear as if the Emperor really didn't care for anything or anyone other than his own goals. However, I think that if you read between the lines, you begin to see that this might not necessarily be true at all. Yes, the Emperor did form an empire and kill billions of people to do it, conquering world after world and leaving others in flames. That can't be ignored. However, he waited thousands and thousands of years before he did this. He held off for humanity to advance to the point where they destroyed themselves with their own technology. He hid in the shadows for eternity on end, never seeking glory or fame for himself until the eve of our own destruction, and even a bit after. He observed as we made mistakes, but never sought to keep us from making them. He simply tried to help us learn from them. It was only after artificial intelligence shattered mankind's interstellar empire, and that we had fallen into a state of post-apocalyptic barbarianism, that he finally decided to take things into his own hands. He had waited, even until humanity was on a straight path towards its own destruction, until the people of Terra were killing themselves to the last man, and unleashing horrific Dark Age of technology weapons upon one another in bids for power over what remained. Yes, he did hastily create the Thunder Warriors, likely out of whatever he could come up with quickly, but he only did this so he could oppose the horrific mutant monsters, psyker warlords, and worse that held a firm grip on planet Earth. What he did after this were the acts of a man who had tried to give humankind every opportunity to save itself, and only in the final hour had realized he'd almost acted too late. The Thunder Warriors were the result of the Emperor finally accepting that humanity wasn't going to save itself before scrambling to try and salvage something, anything, out of the cradle world of Terra. Yes, he designed the Thunder Warriors to die out, and yes, he replaced them with the Astartes. But as the Emperor has admitted himself, he's not all-powerful. He did what he could with what he had, until he could come up with something better in the form of the Space Marine Legions. He might not have even meant to make the Thunder Warriors unstable, considering how his later inability to remove Angron's nails would later prove that he's not possessed of unlimited technological prowess. Additionally, the idea that the Astartes are only meant to be warriors isn't exactly as true as it was for the Thunder Legions. While the Astartes are primarily shock troops, just as the Thunder Warriors were, they're also much more mentally strong than their predecessors. They're all possessed of genius-level IQs, and many even partake in the arts and other hobbies. They also, unlike the Thunder Warriors, have the abilities to contribute in a galaxy without war, to say nothing of the need for a standing army in a galaxy full of Tyranids, vicious Dark Eldar, Necrons, and other unknown threats. The Ultramarines, for example, would make excellent civil planners and administrators. The Imperial Fist were unmatched engineers, and the Iron Warriors would have eventually rivaled the Mechanicus in their understanding of technology, while the Emperor did design the Space Marines as being unable to reproduce, likely to prevent them from overtaking humanity proper, in a worst-case scenario of them spawning too quickly to be controlled. He gave them all a long, but still mortal lifespan, and the aforementioned talents outside of war. So, while yes, he likely would have let them eventually die out by way of natural death if they were no longer needed, he imparted to them skills and things that they could do, likely better than anyone else, in an Imperium that was post-war. And he even made them enjoy doing these things. All because he had more time to design them, and more technology to do so at his disposal. He was no longer rushing to reclaim Terra and stop humanity from completely destroying itself before it was too late. Once he had the luxury, time, and technology that he didn't have when forging the Thunder Warriors, he proved that he would rather create soldiers that were also something more than just brutish killers. And, on the topic of his sons, it's important to remember that he didn't make them mortal at all. Why would the Emperor make the Primarchs ageless if he only intended to use them for a time and then get rid of them? Why wouldn't he just predict a timeline where they'd be useful and then only give them that much life? Well, that's because he likely intended to raise them as true sons, but upon losing them to the warp, and having to search the literal galaxy to find them, he found it hard to bond with them, and was probably wary of what the warp may have done to them. Not to say he didn't still try. Horus Lupercal, Primark of the Luna Wolves, was the first of the Emperor's sons to be discovered. The Emperor actually got to mostly raise him, and as a result he became his father's favored child. The Emperor granted him the title of War Master, and when Horus rebelled against him and eventually faced his father in single combat, the Emperor realized that he was only losing to Horus because he was not able to bring the full brunt of his power to bear against his own flesh and blood. He let Horus rip off his arm, gouge out his eye, and cripple him over and over before he finally watched the War Master strike down a human guardsman who tried to save the Emperor's life. To see Horus so casually kill someone who believed in him and his promise to protect humanity, this and only this was the Emperor's breaking point. After seeing Horus strike down the guardsman, it said that the Emperor was forced to eradicate all compassion, all love, all camaraderie, and all empathy from himself in order to mount one final attack against Horus. It was only after letting go of his love for his son, after expunging it from his very soul, a sacrifice that he resisted making until the last moment, that the Emperor was able to finally strike down the arch-traitor of the heresy. And, to return to the topic of Angron, of course the Emperor avoided him. Angron was his greatest failure, and represented his overall shortcomings when it came to the Primarchs most of all. The Emperor got to Angron too late. He couldn't reverse what had been done to his son. He couldn't remove the nails. The Emperor had failed his child. This is further cemented by the fact that, while each of the Primarchs had an ability all their own, Angron's was the power to take the pain away from others and make it his own. This becomes much more tragic when you realize that all of the Primarch's abilities represented who they were fundamentally. Think about that. The Emperor had to look at Angron, knowing that at his core, he had been a boy who took the pain away from others, and see him turned into a killing machine in constant agony, who could only relieve his own suffering by inflicting suffering upon his victims. And all of this because he hadn't been fast enough to find his son in time, because the Emperor wasn't quite smart enough to fix him, or strong enough to stop his children from being lost in the first place. Because of all of this, he had to see Angron become everything that he was never meant to be. And even still, the Emperor did not do the cold, logical thing and put Angron out of his misery. Angron was clearly a threat. The Emperor had to know how likely it was for his son to fall to the war god Khorne's influence. And yet, he let Angron live. Because he loved his sons. He proved this again most of all when he let Horus nearly butcher him when he never really had to. He might not have loved the Astartes individually, because he didn't know them, much as Guilliman didn't know his own legionaries by name, but he did care enough for them to make sure that they could function in a world without war, and that they had other talents beyond just killing. And while his words of using people as sacrifices to further his goals, and not allowing fear that his enemies might be more intelligent than him to cloud his mind, might appear to make him sound callous and arrogant, I think that they reveal something deeper. The Emperor can fail. He can be wrong. He can doubt himself, even though he may try to deny it. Because he knows that he cannot fail, or else all is lost. Much as Guilliman suggested might be the case, he's a man who never wanted to rule, made obvious by the fact that he waited until the literal last possible moment to do so. The fact that he appears to speak of humans and his sons as mere tools at times is likely a coping mechanism. He had to send his people to war. The universe was dangerous and full of threats that needed to be defended against, and no one else had proven capable of restoring or protecting the human race other than himself. So the Emperor tells himself that he shouldn't fear that he'll fail or that he'll be outsmarted by literal gods. He tells himself that he doesn't love his sons, who he knows he might have to sacrifice for the greater good of humanity, and even lets Malcador think so too, through the use of vague wordplay that even still subtly reveals his hidden emotions. And yet he still hesitates to kill Horus, even knowing that his own death will lead to the utter destruction of humanity. He says humans are mere tools, and yet only the death of a guardsman by Horus's hands is enough to sway him to finally kill his own son so that humanity may live. The Emperor may indeed tell himself that he's above others, and that he alone deserves to rule, but his actions prove that he just wanted to save as many people as he could in the grand scheme of things, and that he never really wanted to take power at all. It took him literal millenniums to finally realize that no one was more capable than him to lead. That's not the hesitance of an arrogant, power-hungry warmonger, but the actions of a good man who didn't want to come to power through the sheer dominance of his own overwhelming might. Yes, the Emperor is a good man. I'll bet one possessed of unfathomable powers, but still also one capable of failing and being wrong, of loving and having to sacrifice, of simply being human. Because the master of mankind, in the end, was just a man himself, in a universe full of horrors and dark gods that he realized no one else could even hope to protect the human race from. One who has perhaps sacrificed the most by allowing himself to become something he never wanted to be called and remembered only by something he never sought, to lose even his real name to time and his own legend, to be known only as the Emperor of Mankind, its cruel, calculating savior.